This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Portland, Oregon, part of our 100-city tour. Today, though, we're spending the hour with world-renowned political dissident, linguist, author, MIT professor Noam Chomsky. As Election Day comes closer, Chomsky examines topics largely ignored or glossed over during the presidential campaign, including the threat posed to U.S. power by the Arab Spring.
Well, moving on to just last year, the Arab Spring is another such threat. It threatens to take that big region out of the grand area. That's a lot more significant than Southeast Asia or South America. You go back to the 1940s, the State Department recognized that the energy resources of the Middle East are what they called one of the greatest material prizes in world history, a spectacular source of strategic power. If we can control Middle East energy, we can control the world. Take a look at the U.S.-British coup in Iran in 1953. Very important event. Its shadow cast over the world until today. That was a pretense that it was part of the Cold War. It had nothing to do with the Cold War. What it had to do was the usual fear, independent nationalism. And it wasn't even concerned with access to oil or profits. It was concerned with control of the oil resources of Iran and, in fact, of the region. And that's a theme that runs right through policy decisions, not discussed much, but it's very important to have control, exactly as State Department advisors pointed out in the 40s. If you can control the oil, you can control most of the world, and that goes on. So far, the threat of the Arab Spring has been pretty well contained in the oil dictatorships, which are the most important ones for the West. Every effort to join the Arab Spring has just been crushed by force. Saudi Arabia was so extreme that when there was an effort to go out into the streets, the security presence was so enormous that people were even afraid to go out. There's a little discussion of what goes on in Bahrain, where it's been crushed, but eastern Saudi Arabia was much worse. The Emirates totally controlled. So that's okay. We managed to ensure that the threat of democracy would be smashed in the most important places. Egypt is an interesting case. It's an important country, not an oil producer. It is a small one. But in Egypt, the United States followed a standard operating procedure. If any of you are going into the diplomatic service, you might as well learn it. There's a standard procedure when one of your favorite dictators gets into trouble. First, you support him as long as possible. But if it becomes really impossible, say the army turns against him, then you send him out to pasture and get the intellectual class to issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy, and then try to restore the old system as much as possible. There's case after case of that. Somoza in Nicaragua, Duvalier in Haiti, Marcos in the Philippines, Chun in South Korea, Mobutu in the Congo, over and over. I mean, it takes genius not to see it. And it's exactly what was done in Egypt and what France tried to do, not quite with as much success in Tunisia. Well, the future is uncertain, but the threat of democracy so far is contained, and it's a real threat. I'll return to that. It's also important to recognize that the decline over the past 50 years is, to a significant extent, self-inflicted, particularly since the 70s. I'll come back to that too. But first, let me say a couple of things about the issues that are most important today and that are being ignored or not dealt with seriously in the electoral campaigns for good reasons. So let me start with the most important issues. There are two of these. They're of overwhelming significance because the fate of the species depends on them. One is environmental disaster, the other is nuclear war. I'm not going to take much time reviewing the threats of environmental disaster. Actually, they're on the front pages almost daily. So, for example, last week, the New York Times had a front page story with the headline, "Ending its Summer Melt. Arctic sea ice sets a new low. That leads to warnings." The melting this summer was far faster than was predicted by the sophisticated computer models and the most recent United Nations report. It's now predicted that the summer ice might be gone by 2020. It was assumed before that it maybe 2050. They quoted scientists who said, "This is a prime example of the built-in conservatism of our climate forecasts. As dire the warnings are about the long-term consequences of heat-trapping emissions, many of us fear that they may still be underestimating the speed and severity of the impending changes." Actually, there's a climate change study program at MIT where I am. They've been warning about this for years and repeatedly have been proven right. The Times report discusses briefly the severe impact of all of this on the global climate, and it adds, but governments have not responded to the change with any greater urgency about limiting greenhouse emissions. To the contrary, their main response has been to plan for exploitation of newly accessible minerals in the Arctic, including drilling for more oil. That is, to accelerate the catastrophe. That's quite interesting. It demonstrates an extraordinary willingness to sacrifice the lives of our children and grandchildren for short-term gain, or perhaps an equally remarkable willingness to shut our eyes so as not to see impending peril. There's things you sometimes find with young infants. Something looks dangerous, close my eyes and won't look at it. Well, there is another possibility. I mean, maybe humans are somehow trying to fulfill a prediction of great American biologist who died recently, Ernst Mayr. He argued years ago that intelligence seems to be a lethal mutation. He had some pretty good evidence. There's a notion of biological success, which is how many of you are there around? You know, that's biological success. And he pointed out that if you look at the tens of billions of species in world history, the ones that are very successful are the ones that mutate very quickly, like bacteria, or the ones that have a fixed ecological niche, like beetles. They seem to make out fine. But as you move up the scale of what we call intelligence, success declines steadily. When you get up to mammals, it's very low. There are very few of them around. And there's a lot of cows. It's only because we domesticate them. When you get to humans, it's the same. Till very recently, much too recent a time to show up in any evolutionary accounting, the humans were very scattered. There were plenty of other hominids, but they disappeared. Probably because humans exterminated them, but nobody knows for sure. Anyhow, maybe we're trying to show that humans just fit into the general pattern. We can exterminate ourselves too, just the rest of the world with us, and we're hell-bent on it right now. Well, let's turn to the elections. Both political parties demand that we make the problem worse. In 2008, both party platforms devoted some space to how the government should address climate change. Today, in the Republican platform, the issue has essentially disappeared. But the platform does demand that Congress take quick action to prevent the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating greenhouse gases. So let's make sure to make it worse. And it also demands that we open Alaska's Arctic refuge to drilling, I'm quoting now, in order to take advantage of all of our American God-given resources. You can't disobey God, after all. On environmental policy, The program says we must restore scientific integrity to our public research institutions and remove political incentives from publicly funded research. All of that's a code word for climate science. Stop funding climate science. Romney himself says there's no scientific consensus, so we should support more debate and investigation within the scientific community, but no action except to act to make the problems worse. Well, what about the Democrats? They concede that there's a problem and advocate that we should work toward an agreement to set emissions limits in unison with other emerging powers. But that's it, no action. And in fact, as Obama has emphasized, we have to work hard to gain what he calls 100 years of energy independence by exploiting domestic or Canadian resources, by fracking and other elaborate technologies. It doesn't ask what the world will look like in 100 years. So there are differences. The differences are basically about how enthusiastically the lemmings should march towards the cliff. Let's turn to the second major issue, nuclear war. It's also on the front pages daily, but in a way that would seem outlandish to some independent observer viewing what's going on Earth, and in fact does seem outlandish to a considerable majority of the countries of the world. The current threat, not for the first time, is in the Middle East, focusing on Iran. The general picture in the West is very clear. It's far too dangerous to allow Iran to reach what's called nuclear capability. That is, the capability enjoyed by many powers, dozens of them, to produce nuclear weapons if they decide to do so. As to whether they've decided, U.S. intelligence says it doesn't know. The International Atomic Energy Agency just produced its most recent report a couple weeks ago, and it concludes, I'll quote it, "It cannot demonstrate the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in Iran." That is, it can't demonstrate something which a condition that can't be satisfied. There's no way to demonstrate the absence of the work. That's convenient. Therefore, Iran must be denied the right to enrich uranium. That's guaranteed to every power that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, that's the picture in the West. It's not the picture in the rest of the world. As you know, I'm sure, there was just a meeting of the non-aligned movement. That's a large majority of the countries in the world and representing most of the world's population, a meeting in Tehran. And once again, not for the first time, they issued a ringing declaration of support for Iran's right to enrich uranium, right that every country has that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Pretty much the same is true in the Arab world. It's interesting. I'll return to that in a moment. There is a basic reason for the concern. It was expressed succinctly by General Lee Butler. He's the former head of the U.S. Strategic Command, which controls nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. He wrote that it is dangerous in the extreme that in the cauldron of animosities that we call the Middle East, one nation should arm itself with nuclear weapons, which may inspire other nations to do so. General Butler, however, was not referring to Iran. He was referring to Israel, the country that ranks highest in European polls as the most dangerous country in the world, right above Iran, and not incidentally in the Arab world, where the public regard the United States as the second most dangerous country right after Israel. In the Arab world, Iran, though disliked, ranks far lower as a threat among the populations, that is, not the dictatorships. With regard to Iranian nuclear weapons, nobody wants them to have them, but in many polls, majorities, sometimes considerable majorities, have said that the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. to balance those of their major threats. Now, there's a lot of commentary in the Western media and journals about Arab attitudes towards Iran. And what you read commonly is that the Arabs want decisive action against Iran, which is true of the dictators. It's not true of the populations. But who cares about the populations, what are called disparagingly the Arab street? We don't care about them. That's a reflection of the extremely deep contempt for democracy among Western elites. I mean, so deep that it can't be perceived. You know, it's just kind of like reflexive. The study of popular attitudes in the Arab world, and there is very extensive study by Western polling agencies, it reveals very quickly why the U.S. and its allies are so concerned about the threat of democracy and are doing what they can to prevent it. They certainly don't want attitudes like those I've just indicated to become policy, while of course issuing rousing statements about our passionate dedication to democracy. Those are relayed obediently by reporters and commentators. Well, unlike Iran, Israel refuses to allow inspections at all, refuses to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has hundreds of nuclear weapons, has advanced delivery systems. Also, it has a long record of violence and repression. It has annexed and settled conquered territories illegally, violation of Security Council orders, many acts of aggression, 5 times against Lebanon alone, no credible pretext. New York Times yesterday, you can read that the Golan Heights are disputed territory, Syrian Golan Heights. There is a UN Security Council resolution 497, which is unanimous, declaring Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights illegal and demanding that it be rescinded. And in fact, it's disputed only in Israel and in the New York Times, which in fact is reflecting actual U.S. policy, not formal U.S. policy. Iran has a record of aggression too. In the last several hundred years, it has invaded and conquered a couple of Arab islands. Now, that was under the Shah, U.S.-imposed dictator with U.S. support. It's actually the only case in several hundred years. Meanwhile, the severe threats of attack continue. You've just been hearing them at the UN from the United States, but particularly Israel. There is a reaction to this at the highest level in the United States. Leon Panetta, Secretary of Defense, he said that we don't want to attack Iran. We hope that Israel won't attack Iran, but Israel's a sovereign country and they have to make their own decisions about what they'll do. You might ask what the reaction would be if you reverse the cast of characters. And those of you who have antiquarian interests might remember that there's a document called the United Nations Charter, the foundation of modern international law, which bars the threat or use of force in international affairs. There are 2 rogue states, the United States and Israel, which regard the Charter and international law as just a boring irrelevance, so do what they like, and that's accepted. Well, these are not just words. There is an ongoing war. It includes terrorism, assassination of nuclear scientists, includes economic war, U.S. threats, not international ones, U.S. threats have cut Iran out of the international financial system. Western military analysts identify what they call weapons of finance as acts of war that justify violent response when they're directed against us, that is. Cutting Iran out of global financial markets is different. The United States is openly carrying out extensive cyber war against Iran. That's praised. The Pentagon regards cyber war as an equivalent to an armed attack, which justifies military response, but that's, of course, when it's directed against us. The leading liberal figure in the State Department, Harold Koh, is the top State Department legal advisor. He says that cyber war is an act of war if it results in significant destruction, like the attacks against Iranian nuclear facilities. And such acts, he says, justify force in self-defense. But of course, he means only attacks against the United States or its clients. Well, Israel's lethal armory, which is enormous, includes advanced submarines recently provided by Germany. These are capable of carrying Israel's nuclear-tipped missiles, and these are sure to be deployed in the Persian Gulf or nearby if Israel proceeds with its plans to bomb Iran, or more likely, I suspect, to try to set up conditions in which the United States will do so. And the United States, of course, has a vast array of nuclear weapons all over the world, but surrounding the region from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, including enough firepower in the Persian Gulf to destroy most of the world. Another story that's in the news right now is the Israeli bombing of the Iraqi reactor in Osirak, which is suggested as a model for Israeli bombing of Iran. It's rarely mentioned, however, that the bombing of the Osirak reactor didn't end Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program. It initiated it. There was no program before it, and the Osirak reactor was not capable of producing uranium for nuclear weapons. But of course, after the bombing, Saddam immediately turned to developing a nuclear weapons program, and if Iran is bombed, it's almost certain to proceed just as Saddam Hussein did after the Osirak bombing.
MIT professor and author Noam Chomsky continues in a moment. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Professor Chomsky will next look at nuclear weapons race, as this week marks the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, often referred to as the most dangerous moment in human history. Back in a moment.